Well, I have a book review I'm going to be doing. It's on this book here called The Jesus Mystery. I actually came across the book from a video that I stumbled upon on YouTube called it was The Lost Years of Jesus. And in that video, I guess the author of this book was part of it, a lady by the name of Janet Bach, and her husband had created the video about their search for Jesus being in India. And then she had written a book to go along with the movie. So you can find the book on Amazon. You can get a used version here, quite a bit cheaper. But I thought it was a well-written book, entertaining, kept my interest. But as we'll find out, I guess the Jesus mystery is still a mystery. I guess there's no proof whatsoever that he had gone to India, which was the theme that the book was trying to show. So just on my channel, there's a couple other videos. I'd really gotten into this when I started researching Jesus in India and read some books, and I highly recommend you check out my video called Jesus in India, The Lost and Missing Years. It has a lot of information that's background to what I'm going to be talking about here. Then I came across a movie called Jesus in India that I'd done a review of, and this last one that I'd watched, The Lost Years of Jesus, with Janet Bach and her husband. And this book is, I'd call it like a supplement to that. And so these just screenshots of those other videos that will be helpful, I think, for you. So I'm just going to go through the chapters and not go through everything, just pick out certain things that I just wanted to highlight. And so you'll see these boxes here with the blue writing, or his quotations from the book that I'm going to be commenting on. So in chapter 1, the title is What 18 Missing Years? And so this is in reference to Jesus in the New Testament. It talks about Jesus' life, being born, and then at the age of 12, he had gone to Jerusalem to attend the Passover festival, was in the temple talking with the Jewish religious leaders, and then the gospel accounts of Jesus, I guess, stopped there, and then they pick back up when he's 30, starting his ministry for about 3 years or so until he gets crucified. So people will say, well, those years from 12 to, say, 30 are missing. The Bible doesn't talk about them, so what happened to Jesus? So many people will try to claim, well, he went to India and Egypt and Persia and all these other places. And so Miss Bach starts her book by saying there was absolutely nothing in my mental storehouse that related to Jesus from the time he was 12 to the time he was 30. A quick check affirmed there was nothing in the Bible either. I think this was part of her problem, a quick check. The second chapter of Luke, after telling of the incident in the temple when Jesus was 12, ends with the words, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature. So you see I highlighted this word stature. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. And in favor with God and man. The next chapter begins with Jesus being baptized by John at what we are told is age 30. So she says, well, the Bible talks about him at 12, but after that, second chapter of Luke, we don't hear anything until he's about 30. And the last words in that chapter of Luke she's referencing is Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature. So if we look at this word stature in the Greek, it's the Greek word helikia, and it has a couple of different meanings to it. Age, length of life, adult age, maturity in years, maturity. It can also mean height, like we would say stature, but has these other meanings to it. And so the same Greek word helikia is used in these other verses in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is talking about the man born blind. The story is related to that, and his parents are speaking back to Jesus. And his parents say, but we don't know how he now sees. So this man who was born blind, Jesus had healed him, but his parents were saying, we don't know how he now sees, and we don't know who opened his eyes, because they weren't there at the time. Ask him. He's of age, or helikia. So this is talking about the age of a person. Again, the same thing in John chapter 9, verse 23. This is why his parents said he's of age. So if we, plug that meaning into this verse here and that Janet Bach quoted, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in age. And it means length of life, so like a length of age, number of age, or maturity in years. So he increased in maturity in age. So if you just take a quick reading of Luke chapter 2 at the end and see stature, you're going to miss it. Janice Bach definitely missed it. So the Bible doesn't say a whole lot about what happened to Jesus during this time, but it does say that he went back to Nazareth with his parents, stayed with them, increased in wisdom, and increased in age, number of years. So he stayed there in Nazareth. He didn't go to India and these other countries that people try to claim he did. And then in this third chapter of Luke, after he's starting his ministry, some other verses give us clues to what happened to Jesus during those supposedly missing years. In Luke chapter 3 says this, and now Jesus himself was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. Luke chapter 4, he went to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. It says where he had been brought up, and he went to the synagogue as was his custom. So if he had left when he was 12 years old and returned at 30, there's no way he could have had a custom of going into the synagogue before he started his ministry. So that just, you can readily infer that he'd been staying in Nazareth, and as he grew older, he'd been going to the synagogue as was his custom. And then again in Luke chapter 4 it says, Jesus said to them, surely you will quote this proverb to me, physician, heal yourself, and you will tell me, do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum. Because if he'd been gone for 18 years, he wouldn't have had a hometown for people to refer to, because he would never have lived there for a long period of time. And in Mark chapter 6 it says, isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? So how can he be a carpenter if he left at age 12 or turned at 30? He wouldn't have time to start a career as a carpenter, so why are they calling him a carpenter? That does not make sense. And so you also see verses in the New Testament where Jesus, says that his hour had not yet come because his time had not yet come. So there was no reason to record every detail of his life from teenage years, from 12 to 30, because that wasn't his main purpose in coming to earth. So nothing was recorded. And then in Mark chapter 6, I think we can assume Jesus was the oldest son of Mary and Joseph. And in Mark 6 it says, isn't this a carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? There's no mention of his father Joseph. Why isn't Joseph mentioned? It's probably because Joseph had died, and Jesus, being the oldest, had to take care of his mother and siblings, and that's what he was doing when he was growing up in his teen years, and there was nothing that needed to be recorded during that time. Then Miss Bach makes another statement talking about this Aquarian Gospel of Jesus Christ, and she says, our search for the lost years had been prompted by a book called the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus Christ. So it seemed like this was somewhat influential in her search for finding Jesus during these supposedly missing years. So this Aquarian Gospel of Jesus Christ is an interesting book written by a man named Levi Dowling. So if you read it, it claims Jesus went to India, Tibet, Persia, Syria, Greece, and Egypt. But it's not based on eyewitness accounts. We would normally think about a historical document, and it's not a historical document because it was actually published in 1907. And so what this book is, as I mentioned, written by a man named Levi Dowling, who claimed to have realized the Aquarian Gospel, the book he wrote, during a series of meditative experiences. He says that he recorded it from a non-physical plane of existence that he referred to as the Akashic Records. And these supposed Akashic Records are a compendium of all human events, thoughts, words, even emotions and intent ever to have occurred in a person's past, present, or future life. So there's this, heard it described as this storehouse computer storehouse of all of our thoughts, what we've done, our deeds, words, emotions, somewhere out there in the universe, and only a few special people can tap into, this wealth of information into some type of meditative state. And that's what he supposedly did. And then based on that, he wrote his book that was published in 1907. So again, there's no evidence that this book is true at all, but people want to believe it. And then she goes on to say that we began to look for other relevant material and soon heard of a book by Russian Nicholas Notovich. And this book is pretty well known for people who believe Jesus had gone to India. It's written by a Russian by the name of Nicholas Notovich. And if you go watch my earlier video, Jesus in India, the Lost and Missing Years, I go in a lot more detail about Nicholas Notovich and a couple of other people, Swami Abhedananda and Nicholas Roerich. But this is a cover of one of the books that I have, the book that Nicholas Notovich wrote called The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ. Excuse me. So he supposedly had gone trekking through northern India in the Ladakh region, had gone to this Tibetan monastery called Hemis, and the Lama there had showed him two big books that supposedly had talked about Jesus being in India. So he got the portions of this translated. Then we came back to Europe. He wrote this book, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, and the section in here, The Life of Saint Isa, describes what he had translated from this Tibetan manuscript that's a part of his book. And Janet Bach goes on to say that, in the book, Notovich tells a fascinating story of his travels, which culminated in an accident. He was thrown from a donkey on a steep mountain path. But if you actually read in Nicholas Notovich's book, and here's a screenshot of the page, it says he actually fell from his horse, not a donkey. So this is a fact that's easy to get correct, but I'm not sure why Miss Bach said he fell from a donkey. So that maybe cause you to question what other facts in the book may not be totally accurate. And so again, watch the video. It goes into a whole lot more detail of Nicholas Notovich and what happened to him. And she goes on to say that 35 years later, in 1922, so I think Nicholas Notovich went to this monastery in, when was it, late 1800s, and then the Swami Abhedananda went to Hemis and said he had been shown the manuscript as well that Nicholas Notovich was shown, and he wrote about that in his book, Swami Abhedananda's Journey into Kashmir and Tibet. And then he translated portions of this manuscript as well, and that's captured in his book. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then Janet Bach goes on to talk about it became evident that early church councils, especially the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, changed many points of doctrine, and it was possible those missing years were expunged. So you also see words like this, it was possible or probably, nothing concrete that says Jesus was there, but it's mere speculation. But really, the nature of Jesus was a main topic of this Council of Nicaea, but Constantine, who was the emperor who chaired that, didn't suddenly realize, the newly established creed that came out of this council contradicted the historical Jesus. You talked about that. The belief captured in the creed was already in existence well before the council even met. And the claim about the details of the missing years being expunged is again a mere assertion with no evidence to support it. But then she goes on to make this statement in this chapter. Of course, the truth about the missing years in Jesus' life cannot be historically proven. Totally agree. And so in chapter 2, she gets more into this legend of Isa that talks about Nicholas Notovich. And then she's going to be quoting various parts from Nicholas Notovich's book that were translated from this Tibetan manuscript that talks about Jesus being in India. And she says the manuscripts relate to us according to the accounts given by merchants arriving from Judea in the same year when the death of Jesus occurred. This is just another assertion that has no basis proven in fact. And then she says, and then this is my comment actually, verses were shown, in this chapter from chapter 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9 from Nicholas Natovich's book, that he transcribed from the Tibetan manuscripts. But it's interesting that there were certain key verses that she did not show in her book, and you're going to see why those weren't. It's interesting, verses 12, 14, and 26 from chapter 5, that she quoted in her book, were not given. And let's kind of look at this here. I'll blow this up a little bit. So these are screenshots again from the actual book. So verse 12 says this: Issa denied the divine origin of the Vedas and the Puranas. These are two of the Hindu scriptures, the Vedas probably being the most revered and the oldest, and the Puranas are later. But what's recorded in this Issa manuscript, this Tibetan manuscript, says Issa denied the divine origin of these Hindu documents. In verse 14 says Issa denied the Trimurti in the incarnation of Pada Brahman, Vishnu, Shiva, and other gods. This is the Hindu trinity. They like to say of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. It says Jesus, or Issa, as he was called in that area, denied this Hindu trinity. And then verse 26 says, do not worship idols, for they do not hear you. Do not listen to the Vedas, where the truth is perverted. So I'm just showing you these verses to say this. People like to point to this Tibetan document as proof that Jesus went to India, but there's verses in here that really should be the last document anybody would want to point to, with statements like these that are made by Jesus. Of course, they'll ignore these and pick and choose what they want to believe. And so we're going to talk more about that as well. So in chapter 4, the title, The Legend is Verified, and then she starts talking about Swami Abhedananda. So the most direct connection we found to the legend was the late Swami Abhedananda, who in 1922 wrote that he saw the manuscripts from which Natovich made his copies and subsequent translations. And she also goes to say that the Swami, he spoke the language and could communicate more easily and directly than the Russian, i.e. Natovich. So she said he saw the manuscripts with Nicholas Natovich had seen. But if you read the Swami's book, he said he saw a single book that was already made up of 14 chapters. Well, Nicholas Natovich said he saw 2 big books, and the verses about Jesus or Issa were scattered throughout these 2 big books, and he had to piece them together because they, made no sense. And after he had pieced all these together, guess how many chapters that made up in his book, that the translations? 14. So here again, here's the exact wording out of Swami Abhedananda's book. The Lama took a singular 1 manuscript, not 2 that Nicholas Natovich was shown, from the shelf and showed it to the Swami. And so when Swami Abhedananda got back to India, he had someone help him help write the book. So this is why it's in the third person. He said that it was an exact translation of the original manuscript that was lying in the monastery of Marbo near Lhasa. It consists of 14 chapters and 224 couplets or slokas. So that's interesting. Swami Abhedananda was shown a single manuscript with, it seems like, already 14 compiled chapters that talked about Issa. Because remember, Nicholas Natovich saw 2 big books that he had to pick out the verses that actually talked about Jesus because they weren't related to each other, just scattered, and then he pieced them together. And that made up 14 chapters in his book that he published. And it also says the Swami got some portion of the manuscript translated with the help of the Lama attending on him. This box said that Swami Abhedananda spoke the language and could communicate more easily than Nicholas Natovich. I'm assuming she's meaning spoken more easily, communicate more easily with the Tibetan Lama, but that doesn't appear to be true, because in his own book it says that Swami Vivekananda had a translator to help him with this. So I don't believe he spoke the language. Some other facts that cause you to doubt. Chapter 5, young Issa departs. So now this Tibetan manuscript, talks about Issa, or Jesus, leaving Israel, and he's going to be trekking over to India. And so she quotes this verse out of the Issa manuscript that says, "Then Issa, secretly absenting himself from his house, left Jerusalem, and in a train of merchants journeyed toward the Sind." And so, as I mentioned earlier, Janet Bach also talked about this Aquarian Gospel of Jesus Christ. That was another book that prompted her in her search for the lost years of Jesus. So let's see what it says about Jesus leaving Israel and going to India. So remember, the Tibetan document says, "Then Issa secretly absented himself from his house." So he left without telling his parents that he was leaving. The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus Christ says this, and it talks about this, if I remember right, this Indian prince named Ravana, who had gone to Jerusalem or Israel. I can't remember exactly why, but he saw Jesus, I believe it was, in the temple in Jerusalem, and just was amazed by his wisdom. And it says that at the end, Ravana made a feast for all the people of the town, and Jesus and his parents were honored guests. So for certain days, Ravana was a guest in Joseph's home, Jesus' father, on Marmion Way, and he sought to learn the secret of the wisdom of the Son, but it was all too great for him. And then he asked that he might be the patron of the child, might take him to the east, where he could learn the wisdom of the Brahms. And Jesus longed to go that he might learn. This is key. And after many days, his parents gave consent. The Issa manuscript said Jesus secretly left the house to go to India. And now this Aquarian Gospel, which is supposed to be talking about the same event in person, read from these Akashic records somewhere out there in the universe, said that this Indian prince Ravana asked his parents to take him to India, and they agreed. So there's a contradiction there. Then Janet Bach goes on to talk about that Muniji explained what the Jains believe. So she'd actually gone to India, talked to some Jains, and this person is telling her that the Jains believe about the possibility that Jesus was in India, or what they believe. And this Jain is telling her this: "We believe that Lord Jesus Christ did come to India, and he came into contact with Jain monks. We believe Jesus Christ did a lot of austerities there alongside Jain monks. He accepted the vows of the Jain monks about celibacy, about nonviolence, and about vegetarianism. This encounter with the Jains was Issa's first concrete experience of another faith, another way of perceiving God." And then when you get to chapter 6, she also again quotes chapter 5, but verse 3 of the Issa manuscript, which says this: "But he," talking about Jesus or Issa, "after he'd gone into India, left the worshippers of Jain and went to Juggernaut in the country of Orsis." I guess some translations may say Orissa and spell Juggernaut a little bit differently. So as I mentioned, this above quote is taken from Nicholas Natovich's book, which is a translation of this Tibetan manuscript. But it's interesting that she didn't cite the verse correctly as it's shown in Nicholas Natovich's book. Because the verse actually said, "But he," Jesus, "left the misguided admirers of Jain and visited Juggernaut in the province of Orsis." I've seen another translation said, instead of misguided, said deluded. This is some more kind of damning evidence of what Jesus thought about the people in the region. And I already quoted the verses where he thought the Vedas had been corrupted, or the truth was not in them. And now he's calling the Jains misguided, but people are still pointing to this Tibetan manuscript as evidence Jesus was in India. And then she goes on to speak about visiting the Jagannath temple in Puri. And she says this, that we learned that only certain caste of Hindus were allowed in the temple, and since we were outcast, we would not be able to enter. But the real drama of Jagannath was the ongoing one just outside the walls, caste with the ill, the elderly, the devastatingly poor, and the lepers. They, as we, were outcast and could not enter. There's only one philosophy I've found that helps me understand the seeming inequality that abounds in the world, the philosophy of action, of karma. So it's kind of interesting that she, not part of the Hindu caste system, considered and called herself an outcast and wasn't allowed to even enter the temple. That seems kind of interesting to me. And so it appeared there were lepers and elderly and poor people outside of the temple. And she did say in her book that the people in the temple would cook meals and give to the people outside of the walls, but they weren't of the right standing to go into the temple. And so she talks about people with these various lepers and probably people with other diseases. So here's a book by Swami Shivananda of the Divine Life Society that we'll talk about also, called Karmas and Diseases. And he says this in his book: the diseases we suffer from the births we get here on earth are all products of actions done by us in previous lives. Okay, karma coming back to us. Here are given some of the many pitiable conditions of life which man has to live in due to his careless, sinful deeds. And so remember, Janet Bach talked about lepers being outside. And so in his book, Karma and Diseases, he says this: so people who indulge with prostitutes commits adultery and leads to an impure life. So as a result of that karma that they've done, the disease they're going to get is leprosy. If you're a murderer of a virgin in a previous life, you're going to become leprous. So these lepers, if you believe what he is saying about karma and reincarnation, these lepers were people in previous lives who indulged with prostitutes, committed adultery, led impure lives, possibly were murderers of virgins. And if you're going to take this doctrine of karma and reincarnation seriously, this is what you're going to have to believe. And if we look at some information from the World Health Organization, this is some statistics about the global leprosy situation. I just kind of found it interesting that of the most cases that they're having, and this is a number from 2004 to 11, by far the largest number of cases are in India. And here's just kind of a bar graph just showing that. Again, this is 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way to 2011. So India is highlighted in yellow, and this darker block next to it is the global number of leprosy cases, or new cases. I believe this chart says trends in new cases detected in Brazil, India, and Indonesia. So India has the largest number by far, followed by Brazil and Indonesia. But look, India, the number of cases of leprosy is looks to be over half of those in the world. So just an interesting question: why are the vast majority of lepers, or at least over half, being reincarnated in India as opposed to somewhere else? And so this is the same thing. So if you want to look at another video I done about Eastern worldview karma and natural disasters, it might be interesting for you, because I put up teachings about karma from Hindu, Buddhist, and theosophical sources. So it's just not my my opinion or from biased sources. These are from the actual sources themselves that talk about how karma actually works. And one of the theosophical documents that I read said there are no innocent victims, if you believe in how actually karma works. So whatever happens to you as a result of your karma, and I don't think people can actually live to that. So people who got killed in the World Trade Center bombing, well, that was part of their karma. They couldn't avoid it. In chapter 7, she goes on to talk about the river of life and death, and then she says that in between the buildings are the ghats, steps leading down to the water which have allowed centuries of pilgrims, including St. Isa, to approach the river, no matter how high or low tide. So this is she's in the city of Rishikesh. But again, she's making an assertion saying that, Jesus walked these steps when he was here, but again, there's no evidence for that. And she goes on to talk about, but there is some interesting information in this book. If you want to get an insight into the beliefs of an Eastern worldview, you can definitely get that from this book. But she says this: the human body is a vehicle for the evolution of the individual soul from the delusion that we are separated from God. So this concept of Maya. And when the goal is reached, it is called self-realization, the experience of knowing that the self is one with God and then realizing it. Our physical bodies are temporary vehicles. I think that's a good explanation, brief, concise explanation of this worldview. Then chapter 8, she goes on to talk about that one of the largest and most well-known ashrams is the Divine Life Society ashram. And so remember, the book I just showed you earlier about karma and diseases was written by Swami Shivananda, who was I believe he's the founder of the Divine Life Society. And so this is situated on the west bank of the river in Rishikesh. It was founded, here it is, by Swami Shivananda. He's revered as one of the great modern spiritual teachers of India. So again, he wrote the book, Karma and Diseases. He's touted as one of the great spiritual teachers of India. So he's saying various diseases that people suffer with are a result of their karma. It can run the gamut. And so she had gone in India, talked to Swami Venkatesananda, who was a private secretary of Swami Shivananda, and quotes from his writings. And so they're talking. And so this other Swami says, at the age of 13, Jesus left home and returned when he was 31 years old. So during his absence, he traveled throughout India, where he practiced yoga, being a perfect yogi, where Jesus could perform miracles. He stopped the waves of the sea, gave sight to the blind, cured lepers through his touch, and fed a multitude of people with a single loaf of bread. Whenever Swami Shivananda spoke of Lord Jesus, those who saw him and heard him speak knew that he knew that what he wrote was true. It was personal knowledge, not gained from the close study of the teachings of Jesus, but from direct realization of what Jesus was and is even today. So again, somehow the Swami knew Jesus had gone to India, but again, there's no evidence to back that up. But like I wrote here, I think people want to believe it so badly, and they hear someone, say authority figure, the Swami, saying it's true, they're going to automatically believe it and not question it, and believe this is a case of confirmation bias, which is, you can see that a lot sometimes in businesses, or people in authority having to make decisions when a phenomenon where decision makers have been shown to actively seek out and assign more weight to evidence that confirms their hypothesis and ignore or underweight evidence that could disconfirm their hypothesis. So in this case of Jesus actually being in India, there is no evidence, but there's a lot more evidence to say that he did not go to India. And she says in her book, talking about Jesus, his divine voice is the same, therefore, as the voice of the Vedas, and the Upanishads, the voice of the Quran, the Zendavestam Dharmapada. The Vedas. But remember what I'd shown you earlier from the Isa manuscript, that is used as, again, evidence Jesus went to India. So she's saying that, hey, Jesus' divine voice is the same voice of the Vedas. But again, according to the Isa manuscript, it's recorded as saying Isa denied the divine origin of the Vedas and the Puranas. He's quoted as saying, do not worship idols, for they do not hear you. Do not listen to the Vedas, where the truth is perverted. So she's talking about a different Jesus than what's recorded in this Isa manuscript. Then she goes on to talk to the Swami Chidananda and ask him about one other question. They start talking about the Shroud of Turin. There's supposed to be this imprint of a person figure left in there that many believe is Christ. This was a shroud used to wrap him when he was put in the tomb, and they talk about that this imprint left on the shroud was due to the fact that Christ dematerialized his body inside the tomb and then rematerialized outside. And she asks, is this dematerialization a yogic power or siddhi? And the Swami says, it's one of the yogic siddhis, the Swami replied, one of the well-known yogic siddhis. Would it have left some emanation upon the shroud, I asked? Swami answered, I do not know the exact inner mechanisms of this dematerialization and rematerialization. It is quite possible, you see again, possible, that it might have given some sort of atomic radiation or something. It is a possibility. You see a lot of this type of wording used in the book. If this is true, then let's test some of these yogic superpowers on current living yogis today. But I doubt we will see any dematerializations and rematerializations. Chapter 10, she goes and visited this Gopi Krishna. She says she has tea with him and asked about the Tibetan legend found by Natovich and the possibility that Jesus had come to India as a young man. And Gopi Krishna says, well, you see, about spiritual matters, legends grow, and probably spiritual men provided the most fertile area for rumors, legends, stories, tales, and such things. I am not sure if he came to India. So this is some more negative information saying, well, he used the words here himself, rumors, legends, stories. But in his teachings, there is that esoteric wisdom that has been known in India for thousands of years. For instance, the doctrine of rebirth. Jesus refers to that. I can't say whether it's from the Indian sources that he got this, or it was from his own inner intuition. So yes, wise words spoken by Gopi Krishna about not being sure Jesus went to India. But again, he's wrong about Jesus actually talking about rebirth or reincarnation. I guess the verses that are normally cited are just reinterpreted, and the doctrine of reincarnation is read into them. And then if you look at this Jewish encyclopedia, there's an article titled Transmigration of the Souls, also termed metempsychosis. They say this about the Jews at the time of Jesus. So this doctrine, reincarnation, was foreign to Judaism until the 8th century. So until the 8th century, the 700s, there was no doctrine of reincarnation with the Jews. But in the 8th century, when under the influence of the Mohammedan mystics, it was adopted by the Karaites and other Jewish dissenters. The doctrine counted so few adherents among the Jews that, with the exception of Abraham ibn Daud, no Jewish philosopher until Hassadi Kreskas even deemed it necessary to refute it. Only with the spread of the Kabbalah did it begin to take root in Judaism, and then it gained believers even among men who were little inclined toward mysticism. And then again, you'll hear claims that verses about reincarnation were in the Bible up until the Council of Constantinople in 533 AD, where they were removed. But this Dr. Paul Eddy, Associate Professor of Theology at Bethel College, says this: the primary purpose of this Council of Constantinople was to ease the tensions in the Church caused by the Council of Chalcedon 100 years previous. Again, there's no evidence whatsoever that the idea of reincarnation was ever discussed, let alone condemned and purged from the Bible. What the reincarnationists are probably referring to here is the condemnation of Origenism. which included belief in the pre-existence of the souls. Origen was one of the church fathers who believed in pre-existence of the souls. But this is not, however, should not be confused with the notions of the karmic cycle of reincarnation. The pre-existence of the soul is not the same as reincarnation. This is clear from Origen's own words that he talks about in a commentary he wrote, where he writes, quote, "The dogma of transmigration, which is foreign to the Church of God, not handed down by the apostles nor anywhere set forth in the scriptures," unquote. So this is words actually from Origen, who people try to cite, one of the church fathers who believed in reincarnation. Here's words that he denied it. Other early theologians, including Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Gregory of Nyssa, also explicitly rejected the idea of reincarnation. Other church fathers. Another problem with this theory is the fact that manuscripts of the Bible exist dating back to the 3rd century, or the 200s. For example, the Bodmer Papyri, the Chester Beatty Papyri, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus are all documents written centuries prior to the 533 Council, and none of them reveal any supposed reincarnationist teachings that were removed from later editions of the Bible. And beyond this, it is known that the core canon of the Bible, which is essentially recognized and acknowledged throughout the Orthodox Church as early as the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, the late hundreds, as evidenced by the list contained in the Muratorian fragment, dated around 170, and all this points toward the impossibility of a conspiratorial purgation of the doctrine of reincarnation, or any other doctrine for that matter, from the Bible during any of the ecumenical councils. So chapter 11, titled St. Issa in Buddhism, she again quotes chapter 5 and verse 12 out of the Issa Tibetan manuscript that says, she quotes, "One law has been given to man to guide him in his actions." But if you're not familiar or haven't read the Issa manuscript, you won't detect that she left off the first part of verse 12 in the quote in her book. And why is that, you may wonder? I think you may be getting the idea, and we've already looked at it. What did verse 12 have to say? Issa denied the divine origin of the Vedas and the Puranas, declaring to his followers, and this is where she starts a quote, "One law had been given to men to guide them in their actions." One law. So she left off this first part that talked about Issa denied the divine origin of the Vedas and the Puranas. I mean, you can only kind of assume that was done on purpose. In verses 14 and 26 of chapter 5, again, aren't quoted, and we've looked at those before, but she quotes a whole number of verses, but leaves these out. And again, verse 14 said that Issa denied the Trimurti and the incarnation of Parabrahma and Vishnu, Shiva, and other gods. Verse 26, "Do not worship idols, for they do not hear you. Do not listen to the Vedas, where the truth is perverted." So these were left out of what she quoted. She goes on to say further that Issa, warned by the Shudras of his danger, left by night Jagannath, where he'd been staying in India, gained the mountain, settled in the country of the Gadamedes, where the great Buddha Shakyamuni came to the world, among a people who worshiped the only sublime Brahma. It's out of chapter 6 of the Issa manuscript. So here we see the backstory. Again, watch my earlier video. Issa has to flee because he had angered the Brahmin, the Kshatriyas, because he was sitting with the Shudras, and the Vaishyas also believe, and he was, teaching them the two lower castes of the Hindu caste systems, with the Brahmins at the top, the Kshatriyas, the warriors and the rulers, the Vaishyas below them, the shopkeepers, and the Shudras at the bottom, who were the servants to the top three castes. And Jesus was spending time with the bottom caste. These Shudras and the upper two castes didn't like that. And Jesus actually, if you read the Issa manuscript, kind of talked badly about the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. In chapter 12, she goes on to talk about, I guess they went up to this place called Dharmasala to try to talk to the Dalai Lama and get information that he had about the legend of Nicholas Knetovich going to this Tibetan monastery called Hemis. So she talks about that they were sitting in the room with the Sherpa in the Lama's dining room. He told us that His Holiness had been asked this question by visitors about 1 year ago and had replied that he had no personal knowledge of the legend. But when we told Sherpa about the corroboration by Swami Abhedananda of seeing the manuscript in 1925, actually said this should be 1922. I don't know if I copied this wrong, but it's kind of irrelevant. Sherpa suggested a search might be instituted by His Holiness. But again, as seen earlier, and what I'm about to show you, I guess there is no corroboration by Swami Abhedananda with what Nicholas Knetovich saw. So again, Nicholas Knetovich, I have 3 editions of his book. He says that he was shown 2 big books, 2 large bound volumes. I believe his original book, Nicholas Knetovich's book, had come out in French, and then it had, I think, 7 publishings in French, and then it came out in English. And so I believe it was translated from French into English. These different editions were translated by different translators. So the wording isn't exactly the same, but they're talking about either 2 big books, 2 large bound volumes, 2 big volumes. Swami Abhedananda said he was shown a single manuscript consisting of 14 chapters that I talked about earlier. Nicholas Knetovich's book, when he talks about translating the Tibetan manuscripts into his diary or his workbook that he had there, he didn't say what language he translated it into. But Swami Abhedananda said he translated it into Russian from what was being read to him from Tibetan. And then how was the manuscript translated? In his book, Nicholas Knetovich said there was an interpreter, but in Swami Abhedananda's book it said it was translated by the Lama there. And watch my other video, I guess Nicholas Knetovich had gone to Hemis a second time after he had supposedly fallen from his horse, had broken his leg. So the Lamas let him stay there, and that's when he was shown these 2 big books. So in his book he said he was there for 2 to 3 days, in one edition 2 to 3 days or a few days. Swami Abhedananda said he was there for a month and a half or 6 weeks. So here's some facts, easy to confirm. Just go read Nicholas Knetovich's book. And I don't know how he got 6 weeks, so that's even makes you question, well, how could the Swami record such, contradictory information in his book? And I don't know, it appears he wasn't even shown the same manuscript that Nicholas Knetovich was shown, or the 2 volumes Nicholas Knetovich was shown. And then she goes on to say that she went down to southern India and had spoken to this Father Adekalam and asked him about the possibility that Jesus had come to India. And this father says, but we have so far understood is that it is only a supposition. They have no historic proof to say that Jesus ever came to India. Accurate characterization by Father Adekalam. Chapter 14, she goes on to talk about that. So 8 months before setting out on our present trip, we had sent a message to Baba. And so I guess if you watch my review of the video, I guess Janet Bach and her husband were followers of Satya Sai Baba for quite a number of years. So before they went on their trip to India, they sent a message to him asking if Jesus had indeed traveled to India. And the response was relayed by friends who were present and took notes as he spoke. They reported Baba said Jesus arrived in India at about age 16. His mother Mary had sold household possessions to help him in his journey. According to Baba, Jesus attained Christ consciousness at the age of 25 while in India. Well, you can see Satya Sai Baba contradicts the Isa manuscript that's being quoted a number of times in this book. Try to show that Jesus had actually gone to India. And there's 2 discrepancies here. Read the Isa manuscript again. It says that in the course of his 14th year, so remember at 12 years old, he'd gone to the temple in Jerusalem. The New Testament Doesn't give much about Jesus' life after that. He journeyed from Israel in the caravan, supposedly, and got to India. And it says in the 14th year, young Isa, blessed by God, journeyed beyond the Sind and settled among the Aryas in the beloved country of God. So it wasn't 16 that he arrived. The Isa manuscript says 14. And Satya Sai Baba said that Mary, his mother, had sold household possessions to help him actually go on this journey. But if you read the Isa manuscript that I showed earlier, the verse, it actually said that Isa, I think I have it here, secretly left the house of his father and journeyed to. So here it is. This version actually says, it was then that Isa clandestinely or secretly left his father's house, went out of Jerusalem, and in company with some merchants, traveled toward the Sind. So Satya Sai Baba contradicts the Isa manuscript, because if Isa left secretly, his mother wouldn't have known he was leaving and would be able to sell household possessions. And Satya Sai Baba also contradicts the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus of Christ that I read earlier, that said this Indian prince Ravana asked his parents if he could go with him to India. So there's all kind of contradictions being spread. No one has the truth on this. She goes on to say, or she again quotes from the Isa manuscript, chapter 11 this time. When the priests and the elders heard Isa, they decided among themselves not to give judgment against him, for he had done no harm to anyone. So now Isa has left India. He had gone up to Nepal, studied with some of the Tibetan Buddhists. Then he had left, journeyed line to Persia, and then he eventually went to Israel. So now she's saying that the priests, talking about the Jewish priests and elders and religious elders, Isa was there, I guess, being brought to trial before Pilate, and they're saying that these Jewish religious leaders could find no fault with Isa, and they're basically, Isa document says that it was Pontius Pilate who wanted Jesus crucified. And so that, what's recorded in the Isa manuscript, contradicts what's in the New Testament Gospels, because it's the other way around. In the New Testament Gospels, the Jewish religious leaders are the one who want Jesus killed, not Pilate. And in the New Testament Gospels, Pilate claims that Jesus is innocent and symbolically washes his hands of having anything to do with his death. That's another area of discrepancy with this Isa manuscript. And Janet Bach then says that the Gospels were written 40 to 90 years after the fact. Say Jesus was arrested at night in the Garden of Gethsemane by order of the Sanhedrin, the high court in the land, and then condemned to death by the Sanhedrin for the court of blasphemy. So he said 40 to 90 years. I guess her book was written a number of years ago, I guess, from what I've read. I guess the gospel accounts are dated like anywhere from 30 to 60 years after the fact. But regardless of the date, 30 to 60 or 40 to 90, in historical terms, that's very early compared to most other ancient records of the time period that historians do not doubt. So a question we should ask, why should we believe the Isa manuscript? When was that written? How many years after the fact can that and be verified and corroborated? Not just taking Nicholas Natovich's word that it was written shortly after the crucifixion event, talking about Jesus going to India. So can Miss Bach provide a date when the Isa manuscript was written? She can't. Then she goes on further to say that the oldest copies of the Gospels date from the 3rd century, so we're faced with a gap of perhaps 200 years. We have fragments of the Gospels dating earlier than the 3rd century A.D. But again, by comparison, what is the earliest copy of the Isa manuscript that we have? Why is that suddenly something we should believe over the New Testament Gospels? That's, as far as I know, the Tibetan monks now can't find these manuscripts. We can't compare them, do any kind of textual criticism among them. So just looking at other historical documents, the author, when they were written, the earliest copy we have of those, Suetonius Tacitus, 900, 1100 years. Homer's Iliad is 400 BC. So time span of anywhere from 500 to over 1,000 years from when it was the earliest copy we have, from when it was written, in the number of manuscripts. Okay, let's do the same thing with the Isa manuscript. When was it written? We don't know. Earliest copy we have, no idea. Time span, how many manuscripts are there? No idea. As opposed to the New Testament, written this time frame, earliest, the time span and the number of manuscript copies is just tremendous. And then she goes on to talk about that the concept of the Trinity was endorsed by Constantine. This is again Nicene Creed. She kind of mentioned that before. In 389, just 64 years after the First Council of Nicaea. You'll hear this a lot too. Christian armies put to fire the Library of Alexandria, which was the greatest known repository of ancient knowledge, forever obscuring the records of the past. So they say these records of the past probably had some Gnostic and other documents that talked about possibly Jesus being in India, or talked about reincarnation, things like that. But Christian armies put that to fire. And I won't read through all this. I covered that in my other video when I talked about the movie that they had made. But if you read that, there's an Eastern Orthodox theologian, David Bentley Hart, who wrote about this in a magazine article. He says there's no single shred of evidence, ancient, medieval, or modern, that Christians were responsible for either collection's destruction. You're talking about the Great Library, and there was another library in Alexandria. And no one before the late 18th century ever suggested they were. We have fairly good accounts of that day, Christian and pagan, so there's not just Christian sources, but pagan sources also. And absolutely none of them so much as hints at the destruction of any large collection of books. Not even Eunapius of Sardis, who was a pagan scholar who despised Christians and who would have wept over the loss of precious texts, suggests such a thing, that the Christians had burned this library. The pagan historian Ammianus Marcellinus describes the Serapion not long before its demolition, had clearly spoken of its libraries as something no longer in existence. Just another article I won't read that says the same thing about the library not being torched by Christian mobs, and this guy's an atheist, so he has really nothing to gain from this. He's being partial, but he says the same thing as I just read above, that there's no evidence. It's still the myth of a Christian mob. Destroying the Great Library of Alexandria is just too juicy for some to resist. And then she goes on to talk about Paramahansa Yogananda, who's the founder of the Self-Realization Fellowship. So he's also known for the miraculous event that occurred after his death. Miraculous in the respect that his body, which at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale, California, showed no signs of physical deterioration for over 20 days. That would be miraculous. And you can Google, and there's an article I found, the miracle at Forest Lawn, Yogananda's incorrupt body. Said after he died, his body was displayed, showed no drying up or marks forming on his body, shrinkage. So she says, showed no signs of physical deterioration. But it's interesting, she did not give additional information, because Paramahansa Yogananda, who died on March 7th, 1952, and was embalmed the next day on March 8th. And this is captured in a letter you can find online that the mortuary wrote to the Self-Realization Fellowship. And it says that embalming of the body of Paramahansa Yogananda took place 24 hours after his demise. Then it does talk about a normal room temperature, and they're trying to say that, well, yeah, it looks like he was, we didn't really see much deterioration in his body. It's kind of unusual. but remember he was embalmed. But the mortuary letter did say that on the late evening of March 26th, we observed a very slight, a barely noticeable change. The appearance on the tip of the nose of a brown spot, about 1/4 inch in diameter. So it wasn't this miraculous sign that everybody says it was. Then a professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia, who's now a professor there, Leonard Angel, had come across the Swami Paramahansa Yogananda's autobiography of yoga. And so he decided to look into this a little bit further, and he actually visited 2 funeral homes at random and asked them about this. And one was licensed embalmer of the Kearney Funeral Home, Miss Ellen Kearney Creenan. And after being informed of the condition of Yogananda's body, she responded, in the light of rather similar cases, that we've had bodies for 2 or 3 months with good preservation. And then a second embalmer that they talked to, Ian Elliott, said, preservation for 20 days through embalming is not unusual. Also, a heavy glass lid was, as described by Mr. Rowe, he's the mortuary, head of the mortuary that wrote the letter to the SRF, Self-Realization Fellowship, described as being present on the casket would prevent a great amount of air circulation, and that in itself would prevent most desiccation. So that would account for it. So there's nothing unusual about a body being embalmed with fluids in use in 1952 without creams and being preserved for 20 days in good condition. So it seems like Paramahansa Yogananda's miraculous, preservation really is not miraculous. And then a post on the Yogananda Ji discussion board that I came across was talking about Paramahansa Yogananda's death. And so he was giving a speech on March 6th at the Los Angeles' Biltmore Hotel for the new Indian ambassador Binay Rajan Sen and his wife. He said after eating a meal, he rose to give a speech. He talked. And then as he finished, Paramahansa lifted his eyes, turned slightly to the right, and slid to the floor, dead. Self-realization disciples claim that their teacher thus performed Maha Samadhi. Maha is great. So yoga's conscious exit from the body. It says great exit. The medical verdict was acute coronary occlusion, i.e. a heart attack. In a 1999 Los Angeles Times article I came across said this, that Yogananda collapsed and died of a heart attack in 1952, given he was 59 years old, while giving a speech at the Biltmore Hotel. So he's famous for this Kriya Yoga technique that he taught, and yoga and other meditation and things are supposed to keep you healthy, but it appears that it didn't really help him live a long and healthy life, dying at, I think, a fairly early age of 59 years old. Supposed to be a master of Kriya Yoga. Died of a heart attack. It is quoted that Yogananda had said that it is true that Christ lived in India during most of the 18 unaccounted for years of his life, studying with the India's great masters. Here's again another guru talking about Christ being in India during most of the 18 unaccounted for years. That again contradicts the Isa manuscript. That says that Isa spent 6 years in Jagannath, Rajagriha, Benares, and other holy cities in India. So that's 6 years. Then it says that, when the Brahmins and Kshatriyas wanted to kill him, he fled to the country of the Gadamedes, the land of the birthplace of Shakyamuni, the Buddha. He learned the Pali tongue. It says in the Isa manuscript, he applied himself to the studies of the sacred rolls of the sutras. 6 years later, Isa, whom the Buddha had chosen to spread his holy word, could perfectly explain the sacred seals. Then after 6 years being there, he left Nepal. So he was in Nepal, not India, for these 6 years. In the Himalaya mountains, descended the valleys of the Rajapur and went westward, preaching to divers people of the supreme perfection of man. Then he goes on to say that sermon spread to neighboring countries when he reached Persia. He was not in India for 18 years, as Paramahansa Yogananda said. So here's some more false information coming from these Hindu gurus. Or it's false if you're going to believe that the Isa manuscript is probably the most highly pointed to that is used to corroborate Jesus being in India. And so in the book, toward the end of the book, Janet Bach talks about her going to India, visiting Sai Baba's ashram or compound there. And she talks about him, he had this technique where he'd move his hand kind of with his fingers closed. It was never like this. The videos I've seen, it was always like this. And then magically these silver medallions and some sacred ash or vibhuti would appear, and he would like sprinkle the ash over the followers. And he'd also kind of magically sit there on his chair and then cough up these elliptical shaped lingams, which is supposed to be totally miraculous. She describes this in her book, and becoming emotional about actually seeing Sai Baba in person. And she says this: he appeared in the distance, walking slowly to the center aisle, then back to the far end of the pavilion, all the while turning from side to side, hands raised in blessing. Tears began to flow as I try as I might, they could not be stopped. So this just, I guess, sounds reminiscent of followers of Christian televangelists or rock stars or people like that, who are conditioned and biased to view these people as kind of beyond human, and they virtually believe and accept anything that is evidence. And she describes an experience of Sai Baba coughing up a lingam from his stomach, where she says he sipped water from a cup, occasionally wiping his brow. The spasms Baba was feeling were now visible, his throat constricted again and again. Then, as he held a white handkerchief in his outstretched hands, we all saw a stream of light emerge from his mouth. He caught it and held it up. It was a lingam. So you can search on YouTube and Google videos of Sai Baba miracles. And there's a couple good ones that show some side views where he's supposedly coughing up this lingam. But yeah, it's kind of interestingly, he usually always has these white handkerchiefs, things on his lap. And so he acts like he's getting ready to cough up the lingam. Some water spurts out of his mouth, but he doesn't open up his mouth very wide. And he lifts the handkerchief or this white towel up his mouth, and lo and behold, the lingam is there, fairly large. And you can see that the lingam was actually in the white towel or handkerchief that was sitting on his lap. It did not come out of his mouth. But I've also seen magicians who can actually regurgitate things out of their stomach. So that also could be a possibility of how this is being done. So just some of my observations from this book. Again, it's not a negative critique of Janet Bach. She actually seems like a really nice person. She's sincere about what she believes, writing what she believes. But, in books like this, you'll see a number of people, sometimes they'll come out and say it directly, but by what they're saying, they're basically saying, hey, what Christians believe is false. We have the truth. This is the truth. This is how you should interpret verses in the Bible that, hey, they talk about reincarnation. You Christians have it wrong. And so, but she's trying to talk about Jesus being in India. There's no substantive proof for any of it, and there's numerous contradictions between different sources that they're believing in. Different beliefs of these Swami and gurus about Jesus being in India contradicting each other, and also contradicting the Isa manuscript, the Quran Gospel of Jesus the Christ, and other sources that they try to point to. So I hope the video was interesting. Check out my other videos as well. And thanks for watching.